Hello again, dear listener. You've arrived at the perfect time for a story from the past, told gently and slowly as night wraps itself around us. Whether you're easing into sleep or simply seeking a soft pause from the day, I'm grateful to be part of your routine. Let me know where you're listening from. Are you watching the sun rise, or is the moon hanging outside your window as it is mine? If these calm historical narratives bring you peace, I invite you to subscribe and come along for many more. What I'm about to reveal will completely change how you understand one of the most celebrated periods in American cultural history. The story you've been told about 1930s Harlem is incomplete. Yes, it was the birthplace of incredible art, music, and literature. But it was also the epicenter of a drug crisis, so devastating that its effects would ripple through generations and reshape the very fabric of American society. In this series, I'm going to take you deep into the shadows of the Harlem Renaissance, where jazz musicians, everyday residents, and entire communities became trapped in a cycle of addiction that nobody saw coming. We'll meet the people who lived through this crisis, understand how heroin first infiltrated these streets, and discover how the response to this epidemic would lay the groundwork for America's approach to drug policy for decades to come. But here's what makes this story truly shocking. This wasn't just a random tragedy that befell a community. The heroin epidemic in the 1930s, Harlem was the result of specific economic pressures, social conditions, and policy decisions that created the perfect storm for widespread addiction. And the way society responded to this crisis would reveal uncomfortable truths about race, class, and justice in America. Let me start by painting the scene of what Harlem looked like before heroin arrived, because understanding this transformation is crucial to grasping the full magnitude of what happened. Harlem in the early 1930s was unlike anywhere else in America. This 25-block area in Upper Manhattan had become the undisputed capital of black culture and creativity. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of African Americans from the rural South to northern cities, and many had settled in Harlem, creating a concentration of talent, ambition, and artistic expression that the world had never seen before. The streets were lined with brownstone apartments that housed writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, musicians like Louis Armstrong and Cab Calloway, and intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. The Apollo Theatre was launching careers that would define American entertainment for generations. The Savoy Ballroom was where new dance crazes were born and spread across the country. This was a community that was creating the soundtrack and literature of modern America. But even in this golden age, market crash of 1929, cracks were beginning to show. The stocked hit Harlem particularly hard. The first fire black workers were typically and are last hired during economic downturns, and unemployment rates in Harlem were double those of white neighborhoods. Many families who had migrated north seeking opportunity found themselves struggling to make rent in overpriced, overcrowded tenements. The speakeasy culture of prohibition had already introduced many residents to illegal substances and underground economies. When alcohol was banned, people didn't stop drinking. They just found new ways to get what they wanted. This created networks of illegal distribution and normalized the idea of breaking laws that seemed arbitrary or unjust. Enter Malcolm Little, though the world wouldn't know him as Malcolm X for many years yet. In 1940, he was just a 17-year-old kid from Michigan who had dropped out of school and was making his way to Boston, then New York. He was drawn to Harlem like so many others, seeking the excitement and opportunity that this legendary neighborhood promised. Malcolm's first impression of Harlem was electric. Years later, he would write about stepping off the subway at 125th Street and feeling like he had entered a different world entirely. The energy was intoxicating. People dressed with a style and sophistication that made him feel immediately underdressed. The music spilling out of clubs and apartments created a constant soundtrack that seemed to give rhythm to every step. But Malcolm also noticed something else. In the pool halls and on corners, He saw people who moved certain street differently. Their eyes had a distant quality, their speech was slower, and they seemed to exist in a separate reality from the bustling activity around them. These were the early victims of heroin, though Malcolm didn't understand what he was seeing at the time. The drug had arrived in Harlem around 1935, initially through the same networks that had been smuggling alcohol during Prohibition. When Prohibition ended in 1933, these criminal organizations needed new products to maintain their profit margins. Heroin, which could be produced cheaply and sold at enormous markups, became the perfect replacement for bootleg liquor. The Italian-American organized crime families who controlled much of the illegal alcohol trade quickly pivoted to narcotics. They had the connections, the distribution networks, and the corruption of local officials necessary to move large quantities of drugs. But they needed local dealers who understood the community and could blend in with residents. This is where the story becomes particularly tragic. Many of the initial dealers in Harlem were musicians. Think about it from their perspective. Jazz musicians in the 1930s lived precarious financial lives. Even successful performers might make good money for a few weeks or months, then struggle to find steady work. Club owners often paid poorly or irregularly. Recording opportunities were limited and didn't provide sustainable income for most artists. Musicians needed flexible work that could accommodate irregular performance schedules. Drug musician could sell dealing offered exactly that kind of flexibility. A during the day and perform at night. The profit margins were substantial enough that even small-scale dealing could supplement irregular performance income. And musicians already had extensive social networks throughout the community, making them natural candidates for distribution. But here's the insidious part. Many of these musician dealers quickly became users themselves. Heroin was marketed to the jazz community as a creativity enhancer. Dealers claimed it would make musicians play with more soul, more feeling, more authenticity. They pointed to famous musicians who were rumored to use the drug and suggested that heroin was the secret ingredient that separated great artists from merely good ones. This wasn't entirely fabricated marketing. Heroin does produce a temporary sense of euphoria and emotional numbness that some musicians found appealing, especially when dealing with the psychological stress of performing or the frustration of racial discrimination. In a society that treated even the most talented black artists as second-class citizens, the temporary escape that heroin provided seemed like a reasonable coping mechanism. Charlie Parker, who would become one of the most influential jazz musicians of all time, began using heroin in Kansas City in the late 1930s before moving to New York. His incredible talent made him a mag musicians, and unfortunately, net for other, his drug use became part of his legend. Young musicians who idolized Parker began to believe that using heroin was somehow connected to achieving his level of artistic brilliance. This created a devastating feedback loop. As more prominent musicians became addicted, the drug gained credibility within the artistic community. Young people who moved to Harlem hoping to make it in the music scene saw heroin use as part of the culture they wanted to join. But the reality of heroin addiction bore no resemblance to the romantic image being sold to potential users. Sarah Johnson was a 19-year-old aspiring singer who arrived in Harlem from Philadelphia in 1938. She had a beautiful voice and enough talent to get occasional gigs at smaller clubs around the neighborhood. Like many young performers, she struggled financially between performances and took various odd jobs to pay rent for the tiny she shared with two-room other women in a boarding house on 145th Street. Sarah's introduction to heroin came through Tommy Williams, a saxophone player who performed regularly at a club called the Dark Tower Cha. Tommy was rhythmic, well-dressed, and seemed to know everyone in the music scene. He took an interest in Sarah's career and promised to introduce her to club owners and booking agents who could help advance her singing career. Tommy's promises weren't entirely empty. He did have genuine connections in the music world, and he did introduce Sarah to people who could help her career. But he also gradually introduced her to heroin, initially presenting it as something that would help calm her nerves before performances and allow her to connect more emotionally with her songs. The progression was subtle and deliberate. First, Tommy offered Sarah small amounts of the drug before important performances, claiming it would give her confidence and stage presence. The initial experiences seemed positive. Sarah felt relaxed, confident, and emotionally open in ways that did seem to enhance her singing. But as anyone who understands addiction knows, this initial positive experience was temporary and deceptive. Within months, Sarah found herself dependent on heroin not just for performing, but for basic daily functioning. The drug that had initially seemed to enhance her abilities began to consume her life entirely. Sarah's story illustrates how heroin infiltrated the Harlem community through trusted social networks and was presented as a tool for success rather than a path to destruction. The dealers weren't strangers lurking in dark alleys. They were often friends, romantic partners, or respected figures in the artistic community who genuinely believed they were sharing something beneficial. This social integration made the drug particularly insidious and difficult to combat. When the people introducing heroin to the community were beloved musicians, charismatic performers, and trusted friends, it was much harder for potential users to recognize the danger they were facing. By 1940, heroin addiction had spread far beyond the jazz community and was affecting residents across all segments of Harlem society. Factory workers used the drug to cope with exhausting physical labor and inadequate wages. Domestic workers who cleaned wealthy white households found that heroin helped them endure the psychological stress of subservient positions. Even students and young professionals began experimenting with the drug as it became increasingly normalized within the community. The transformation was visible on the streets. Buildings that had once housed thriving businesses began to show signs of neglect as owners and employees struggled with addiction. Families that had been pillars of the community found themselves torn apart as parents, children, and siblings became consumed by their need for drugs. What made this crisis particularly devastating was how it intersected with existing social and economic pressures facing the Harlem community. This wasn't just a story about individual choices or moral failings. The heroin epidemic took hold in Harlem precisely because this community was already under enormous strain from systemic racism, economic inequality, and social marginalization. The very factors that had made Harlem a center of cultural creativity also made it vulnerable to drug trafficking and addiction. The geographic concentration of black residents in Harlem created a perfect target for drug traffickers. Unlike other neighborhoods where different ethnic and economic groups were scattered throughout various areas, Harlem represented a contained market where dealers could establish territory and build customer bases efficiently. The same social networks that had made the Harlem Renaissance possible became pathways for drug distribution. Think about how this worked in practice. When someone like Tommy Williams became a dealer, he wasn't just selling to strangers. He was selling to people he performed with, people he ate dinner with, people whose families he knew. The trust relationships that had built this community became the very mechanisms through which heroin spread. Marcus Thompson learned this lesson the hard way. Marcus was a postal worker who had moved to Harlem from Virginia in 1932 with his wife Dorothy and their 2 young children. He was exactly the kind of responsible, hard-working family man who represented the backbone of the community. Marcus worked steady hours, paid his rent on time, attended church regularly, and coached a youth baseball team in Marcus Garvey Park on weekends. Marcus had no interest in the nightclub scene or the artistic lifestyle that defined much of Harlem's public image. He was focused on providing stability for his family and building a better life than what had been possible in the rural South. But even Marcus couldn't escape the reach of heroin as it spread through the community. The connection came through his brother-in-law, James, who worked as a janitor at the Apollo Theatre. James had access to the backstage world of Harlem's entertainment industry and had begun using heroin after Who performed at being introduced to it by musicians the venue. Initially, James kept his drug use secret from the family, but as his addiction progressed, he began asking Marcus for money to cover rent and basic expenses. Marcus, being a devoted family man, couldn't watch his wife's brother struggle without trying to help. He lent James money repeatedly, believing that his brother-in-law was simply going through a rough financial period. It took months before Marcus understood that the money was going directly to drug dealers. By the time Marcus discovered the truth, James was so deep into addiction that he was stealing from the Apollo Theatre to support his habit. When James was fired and could no longer afford his own apartment, Dorothy insisted that her brother move in with their family temporarily while he got back on his feet. This decision, made with the best of intentions, brought heroin directly into Marcus's household. James would disappear for days at a time, then return in various states of intoxication or withdrawal. The children began asking questions about their uncle's strange behavior. Dorothy spent sleepless nights worrying about her brother and trying to shield the children from what was happening. The stress of the situation began affecting Marcus's work performance and his relationship with Dorothy. They argued constantly about how to handle James, and her responsibility with Dorothy torn to her brother to protect between her loyalty her children. Marcus felt trapped between his desire to help family and his recognition that James's presence was. The situation destroying their household stability reached a breaking point when Marcus came home from work one afternoon to find James unconscious on the living room floor, a needle still in his arm, with the two children standing in the doorway, staring at their uncle in confusion and fear. This scene was playing addiction out in households across Harlem as spread through family networks and social connections. The drug didn't just affect individual users, it created ripple effects that touched everyone connected to those users. Children were exposed to addiction and overdoses. Spouses struggled to understand what was happening to their partners. Parents watched adult children disappear into a world they couldn't comprehend. What made this particularly heartbreaking was how unprepared the community was for this type of crisis. Harlem had dealt with poverty, discrimination, and violence. But heroin addiction represented something entirely different. The traditional support systems that had helped residents cope with other challenges seemed powerless against this new threat. Religious leaders found that spiritual guidance alone couldn't address the physical reality of chemical dependency. Community organizations that had successfully tackled housing and employment issues discovered that addiction required specialized knowledge and resources they didn't possess. Even strong families like Marcus and Dorothy's found themselves overwhelmed by the complexity of helping an addicted family member. Meanwhile, the dealers who had introduced heroin to the community were becoming wealthy and powerful. What had started as small-scale operations, run by individual musicians or part-time dealers, evolved into sophisticated criminal enterprises with hierarchical structures and territorial control. Vincent Marquez had arrived in New York from Puerto Rico in 1936 and quickly recognized the business opportunity that heroin represented in Harlem. Unlike the musician dealers who had initially distributed the drug within their social circles, Vincent approached drug dealing as a serious business venture that required strategic planning and professional execution. Vincent understood that sustainable drug dealing required more than just having a product to sell. He needed reliable supply chains, effective distribution networks, protection from law enforcement, and systems for managing the inevitable conflicts that arose in illegal markets. He began by establishing relationships with the Italian-American crime families who controlled heroin importation and wholesale distribution. These organizations needed local partners who could manage street-level sales in black neighborhoods without attracting unwanted attention from police or rival groups. To be exactly, Vincent proved the kind of partner these organizations wanted. He was intelligent enough to understand the business aspects of drug trafficking, Ruth the violent competitionless enough to handle that came with illegal markets, and sophisticated enough to maintain the load operations to continue profile that allow without constant law enforcement interference. Within 2 years, Vincent had built a network of dealers' blocks of prime who controlled several territory in central Harlem. His organization employed lookouts who watched for police, runners who transported drugs and money, dealers who interacted directly with customers, and enforcers who handled disputes and protected territory from competitors. This wasn't the chaotic, disorganized drug dealing that people often imagine. Vincent ran his operation like a legitimate business, complete with regular meetings, performance evaluations, and strategic dealers who worked for him were expected to dress professionally, treat customers respectfully, and maintain detailed records of their sales. The sophistication of Vincent's operation allowed it to serve customers efficiently, while minimizing the risks that typically came with illegal drug markets. Customers knew where to find reliable products at consistent prices. Dealers had steady employment with clear expectations and regular income. Even law enforcement found it difficult to penetrate an organization that operated with such discipline and professionalism. But this efficiency came at a terrible cost for the Harlem community. Vincent's success encouraged other criminal organizations to establish competing operations in the neighborhood. As more dealers entered the market, competition intensified and violence increased. Territory disputes that might have been resolved through negotiation in legitimate businesses were settled through intimidation and violence in the heroin trade. Dealers who failed to pay debts or who sold in areas controlled by rival organizations faced beatings, shootings, or worse. The violence wasn't limited to people directly involved in drug dealing. Innocent between rival dealers. Children walking residents found themselves caught in conflicts, organizations. Business owners were to school had to navigate territories controlled by different pressured to allow drug dealers to operate from their establishments or face harassment and vandalism. Louise Washington firsthand. Louise experienced this violence was a 45-year-old widow who owned a small grocery store on 132nd Street that had served the community for over a decade. Her store was a neighborhood institution where residents could buy basic necessities, cash checks, and catch up on local news and gossip. In 1941, Vincent's organization approached Louise about using her store as a front for their drug dealing operation. They offered to pay her rent and provide additional income in exchange for allowing dealers to operate from the back of her store and use her business to launder drug money. Louise refused. She had built her business to serve her community, not to facilitate its destruction. She had watched too many of her regular customers disappear into addiction to consider participating in the drug trade, regardless of the financial benefits. Vincent's organization didn't acceptfully. They began her refusal grass, pressuring Louise through escalating acts of intimidation. First, they sent customers to her store, who would browse for hours without buying anything, driving away legitimate customers. Then they began vandalizing her storefront during the night, painting threatening, breaking windows, and spray messages on her walls. When these tactics failed to change aided. One Louise's position, the violence escalate evening as she was closing Hurley behind her building and store, two men cornered her in the all, beat her severely enough to require hospitalization. The message illustrates how heroin trafficking entire social environment of Harlem was clear. Cooperate with the drug dealers or face worse consequences. Louise's situation transformed the direct connection to drug use or dealing. The violence and affecting even people who had not intimidation that came changed how residents interacted with each other. An atmosphere of fear that with the drug trade created and moved through their after school rather began keeping children inside own neighborhood. Parents, then allowing them to play in owners closed, become dangerous. Business streets that had earlier and hired security guards they couldn't afford. Church attendance declined as people became afraid to walk, to that had made Harlem a center of cultural creativity evening services. The community institutions began to deteriorate under related violence and the pressure of drugption. The same social disrue streets that had once been filled with people socializing, conducting business, and creating art became places where residents hurried past without making eye contact. People who were for young were. This transformation was particularly devastating coming of age during this period. Teenagers who might have found mentorship and opportunity in the vibrant community life of earlier decades instead found themselves navigated by addiction, violence, and fear eating a landscape dominate years-old inn. Robert Davis was 15, 1942 and grandparents. They, up hearing stories about the Golden, had grown age of Harlem from his parents and told him about street corners, about a time when Harlem felt neighborhoods together, about famous impromptu concerts on block parties that brought entire musicians who would perform impro like the most exciting place, indifferent from these stories. By the Harlem that Robert knew was very the world. But time, he was old enough to explore the neighborhood independently. Many closed or had been taken, filled with families that had once been over, by drug of the venues his parents had described, were dealers. The streets and children were now dominated by young men who seemed to be in a perpetual state of alertness, and this to protect him from danger and to exist in a perpetual triaration. Robert's parents, environment keeping him busy with school activities and part church-time jobs, but it was impossible to completely insulate a teenager from the reality of his own neighborhood. Robert saw every day as he walked to school, went to work, the effects of heroin addiction, or visited friends. Some of his older cousins had become addicted to heroin and had transformed from promising young people into desperate individuals struggle with the decision. Robert watched his parents from their own families to support their drug habits, who would steal these family members, or to cut of whether to continue helping them off to protect their own household. The choices. Facing young to become people like Robert are much more limited, dangerous than they'd had been for previous generations. The legitimate opportunities that had drawn, nearing as businesses closed and community people disapped to Harlem during, where the Renaissance organizations struggled with membership and resources. At reduced the same time, the drug trade offered impossible to achieve immediate financial rewards that seemed through legal could earn more employment money in a week. Teenagers of dealing drugs than their parents made in a month of legitimate work. This economic reality created a terrible dilemma for young people and their families. Parents who wanted their children to stay away from drugs and crime found it difficult to provide compelling alternatives when legal employment offered such limited opportunities for advancement. The drug dealers understood this vulnerability perfectly and exploited it with calculated precision. They didn't just sell heroin, they sold dreams, status, and belonging to young people who felt cut off from legitimate paths to success. Take the story of Michael Rodriguez, a 16-year-old who lived with his mother in a cramped apartment on Amsterdam Avenue. Michael was bright, articulate, and had shown the heroin epidemic began real promise as a student before reshaping his neighborhood. His teachers consistently praised his writing abilities and encouraged him to consider college, something that would have made him the first in his family to pursue higher education. But by 1943, Michael's school was struggling with overcrowding, underfunding, and teacher shortages as many educators had left to take better-paying jobs in white neighborhoods or to support the war effort. Class sizes had swollen to over 40 students, making individual attention nearly impossible. The building itself was falling apart, with broken windows that let in cold air during winter and inadequate ventilation that made classrooms stifling during warmer months. Michael watched as several of his older friends dropped out to work in factories or joined the military, while others simply disappeared into the drug world that seemed to offer more immediate rewards than education. The contrast between what school promised and what it actually delivered became increasingly stark as the heroin trade demonstrated its economic power right outside the school building. Vincent's organization had deliberately positioned dealers near schools, not because they were specifically targeting children, but because schools represented gathering places where young people congregated and socialized. These dealers dressed well, carried impressive amounts of cash, and seemed to command respect from adults in the community who feared crossing them. For a teenager like Michael, watching these dealers operate was like seeing a completely different version of success than what his teachers described. While his English teacher talked about the importance of education for future opportunities, the dealers outside demonstrated immediate power, respect, and financial independence. The turning point came when Michael's mother, Carmen, lost her job at a textile factory that closed down due to wartime production shifts. Carmen had been the sole provider for her family since Michael's father died in a construction accident 3 years earlier. Without her factory wages, they couldn't afford rent, food, and the basic necessities that Michael had always taken for granted. Carmen tried desperately to find new employment, but opportunities for middle-aged Puerto Rican women in wartime New York were extremely limited. She took whatever work she could find, cleaning offices at night, doing laundry for wealthier families, and occasionally finding day labor in garment factories that needed temporary workers. Even working multiple jobs, Carmen couldn't earn enough to maintain their previous standard of living. Michael watched his mother exhaust herself working 18-hour days and still struggle to put food on the table. The electricity was shut off twice for non-payment. They were constantly behind on rent, living with the threat of eviction hanging over their daily lives. This economic desperation created exactly the conditions that drug dealers like Vincent understood how to exploit. When a well-dressed dealer approached Michael outside school and offered him $50 just to deliver a package across the neighborhood, the money represented more than Michael's mother could earn in a week of backbreaking labor. The dealer, who introduced himself as Carlos, didn't present this as drug dealing. He described it as a simple delivery service, explaining that busy businessmen needed reliable young people to transport packages between different locations. Carlos emphasized that Michael wouldn't be selling anything or interacting with customers. He would simply be a courier, moving items from one address to another. The $50 Carlos offered wasn't just money to Michael. It represented the ability to help his mother pay rent, buy groceries, and maybe even get the electricity turned back on. It represented dignity for a family that had been forced to rely on charity from their church and neighbors. Most importantly, it represented a way for Michael to contribute to his family's survival, rather than being a financial burden. Michael's first delivery seemed exactly as innocent as Carlos had described. He picked up a small package from an apartment building on 135th Street and delivered it to another apartment building on 142nd Street. The entire transaction took less than 30 minutes, and Michael received his $50 in cash with no questions asked and no complications. The simplicity and profitability of this work was intoxicating for a 16-year-old who'd been watching his family struggle financially. Michael began making deliveries regularly, sometimes earning more in a single afternoon than his mother made in several days of exhausting labor. What Michael didn't understand initially was how carefully Vincent's organization had designed this recruitment process. New couriers like Michael were deliberately kept ignorant about what they were transporting and how the larger operation functioned. This protected the organization if couriers were arrested, since they couldn't provide information about higher-level dealers or operational details. More importantly, it allowed young people like Michael to rationalize their participation by maintaining the fiction that they weren't really involved in drug dealing. As long as Michael could tell himself he was just delivering packages, he could avoid confronting the reality that he was helping distribute heroin throughout his own community. This psychological buffer recruiting was crucial for young people who'd moral Haitians about drug dealing, but reserve were desperate enough to consider illegal work. Vincent's organization understood that most teenagers from stable families wouldn't immediately agree to sell drugs, but they might agree to what seemed like simple courier work. The transition from courier to dealer was gradual and carefully managed. After several weeks of successful deliveries, Carlos began asking Michael to do slightly more complex tasks. Instead of just dropping off packages, Michael was asked to wait for return packages. Then, he was asked to collect money along with the return packages. Each new responsibility came with additional pay and was presented as a natural evolution of the work he was already doing. Within 3 months, Michael was effectively functioning as a low-level dealer, though he still thought of himself primarily as a courier. He was interacting directly with customers, handling money and drugs simultaneously, and taking on the risks that came with street-level drug dealing. The money was transformative for Michael's family. They caught up on their rent, restored their electricity, and began eating regular meals again. Carmen noticed the improvement in their financial situation, but didn't immediately question where the money was coming from. Michael told her he had found part-time work helping a local businessman with deliveries, which was technically true, even if it omitted crucial details. Carmen was so relieved to see their financial stress reduced that she didn't probe too deeply into the specifics of Michael's employment. Like many parents during this period, she was focused on day-to-day survival and was grateful for any legitimate-seeming income that helped stabilize their household. This family dynamic illustrates how the heroin trade infiltrated communities through economic necessity rather than moral corruption. Michael wasn't drawn to drug dealing by greed or excitement. He was responding to genuine financial crisis that threatened his family's basic survival. Carmen wasn't willfully ignorant about her son's activities. She was overwhelmed by her own struggles and desperately hoping that their improved circumstances represented a positive change in their fortunes. The tragedy of Michael's story is how it demonstrates the impossible choices facing families during this period. Carmen had raised Michael with strong values and clear expectations about right and wrong. Under normal circumstances, Michael would never have considered involvement with drug dealers, but the economic pressures created by systemic inequality and social marginalization made illegal work seem like the only viable option for helping his family survive. This pattern repeated itself across Harlem as the heroin epidemic expanded. Young people who had been raised in loving, principled families found themselves drawn into the drug trade, not by moral failing, but by economic desperation. Parents who had worked hard to provide good examples for their children watched helplessly as legitimate opportunities disappeared and illegal alternatives became increasingly attractive. The community institutions that might have provided alternatives were themselves struggling with the effects of the epidemic. Churches that had traditionally offered guidance and support to young people found their congregations shrinking as families moved away or became consumed by addiction-related crises. Community centers that had provided recreational activities and mentorship programs lost funding and volunteer support as the neighborhood's social fabric deteriorated. Schools like the one Michael attended became increasingly dysfunctional as teachers left for better opportunities and administrators struggled with overcrowding and underfunding. The educational system that was supposed to provide young people with pathways to legitimate success was failing, just as illegal alternatives became more profitable and accessible. Even the police response to the growing heroin problem inadvertently made the situation worse for families like Michael's. Law enforcement agencies in the 1940s had little understanding of drug addiction as a medical condition and treated all drug-related crime as evidence of moral failure that required punishment rather than treatment. When police did conduct raids or make arrests, they typically focused on street-level dealers and users rather than the higher-level organizers who actually controlled the drug trade. This meant that young people like Michael, who were often the most desperate and least powerful participants in the drug economy, faced the harshest consequences, while the people who profited most from their participation remained relatively safe. Detective Frank Murphy had been working in Harlem for 8 years when the heroin epidemic began, and he watched with growing frustration as traditional police methods proved inadequate for addressing this new type of crime. Murphy had grown up in an Irish neighborhood in the Bronx and had joined the police force with genuine intentions of serving and protecting communities. When Murphy was first assigned to Harlem in 1935, most of his work involved familiar types of crime, domestic disputes, theft, occasional violence related to gambling or personal conflicts. These were problems he understood and felt equipped to handle through conventional police work. But heroin created entirely different challenges that Murphy and his colleagues were unprepared to address. Traditional police work focused on solving individual crimes after they occurred, but drug addiction created ongoing cycles of criminal behavior that couldn't be resolved through arrests and prosecutions alone. Murphy found himself arresting the same people repeatedly for drug-related offenses, only to see them return to the streets within days or weeks to resume the same behaviors that had led to their previous arrests. Young men like Michael would be arrested for drug dealing, spend a few weeks in jail, then return to the same corners to continue selling drugs because they had no other viable options for supporting themselves or their families. This revolving door of arrests and releases was frustrating for police officers who wanted to see their work produce lasting improvements in community safety. More importantly, it was devastating for the individuals caught in this cycle, who accumulated criminal records that made legitimate employment even more difficult to obtain, while doing nothing to address the underlying economic and social conditions that had led them to drug dealing in the first place. Murphy began to understand that the young dealers he was arresting were often victims themselves, trapped between impossible economic pressures and a criminal justice system that offered punishment without rehabilitation or genuine alternatives. But this understanding didn't change his job responsibilities or provide him with better tools for addressing the crisis. The police heroin epidemic department's approach to the reflected broader social attitudes about race, crime, and personal responsibility that would shape drug American policy for decades to come. When similar drug problems affected white middle-class communities, they were typically viewed as medical issues requiring treatment and support. But when drugs affected predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods like Harlem, they were viewed as criminal issues requiring punishment and incarceration. This disparity in response wasn't accidental. It reflected deep-seated beliefs about which communities deserved compassion and support versus which communities deserved punishment and control. The heroin epidemic in Harlem was occurring during a period when many white Americans viewed Black urban communities as inherently dangerous and criminal, making it easier to justify harsh law enforcement responses rather than investment in treatment or social services. The result was a policy approach that criminalized addiction rather than treating it, punished symptoms rather than addressing causes, and created cycles of incarceration that made the underlying problems worse rather than better. Young people like Michael found themselves caught in a system that offered them few legitimate opportunities while severely punishing their participation in illegal alternatives. Meanwhile, the drug dealers who had created this crisis continued to profit and expand their operations. Vincent's organization had grown from a small network of individual dealers to a sophisticated criminal enterprise that controlled significant territory and generated substantial revenue. By 1944, Vincent employed over 50 people in various capacities and was moving enough heroin to supply dealers throughout Harlem and into other neighborhoods in Manhattan and the Bronx. His success had attracted attention from larger organized crime families who wanted to expand their involvement in the lucrative drug trade. This expansion brought new levels of violence and complexity to the heroin epidemic in Harlem. As different criminal organizations competed for territory and market share, the violence that had initially been limited to disputes between individual dealers escalated into more systematic and deadly conflicts. The escalation began with the arrival of Tony Marcelli in the summer of 1944. Marcelli represented the Genovese crime family's interests in expanding their narcotics operations beyond their traditional territories in Little Italy and the Lower East Side. Unlike Vincent, who had built his organization from the ground up within the Harlem community, Marcelli came with backing from one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New York. Marcelli's approach to drug trafficking was fundamentally different from Vincent's community-based model, where Vincent had focused on building relationships and maintaining relatively low-profile operations. Marcelli believed in establishing dominance through intimidation and overwhelming force. He arrived in Harlem with a crew of experienced enforcers and enough capital to undercut Vincent's prices while maintaining higher profit margins through volume sales. The conflict between these two approaches to drug dealing would transform Harlem's streets into a battleground that claimed dozens of lives and terrorized residents who had already been struggling with the effects of widespread addiction. The first major confrontation occurred on a humid August evening outside the Red Rooster, a popular restaurant on 138th Street that had become an unofficial meeting place for Vincent's dealers. Marcelli's crew arrived in 2 black sedans and immediately began challenging Vincent's people for control of the corner where they typically conducted business. What started as a verbal argument about territorial rights quickly escalated into gunfire that left 3 people dead and 7 wounded. Among the casualties was Betty Morrison, a 34-year-old seamstress who had been walking home from her job at a garment factory and had the misfortune of being on the sidewalk when the shooting began. Betty had no connection to drug dealing and had spent years trying to shield her 2 young daughters from the growing violence in their neighborhood. She worked double shifts to save money for a deposit on an apartment in a safer area, dreaming of giving her children the kind of childhood she remembered having before heroin changed everything about their community. The bullet that killed Betty was fired by one of Marcelli's enforcers, but it could just as easily have come from Vincent's crew. The chaos of the gunfight, nobody could determine exactly which shots came from which guns. What mattered to Betty's daughters, 8-year-old Patricia and 10-year-old Linda, was that their mother was dead because grown men were fighting over the right to sell poison in their neighborhood. Patricia and Linda Morrison suddenly found themselves orphans in a community that was increasingly unable to care for its most vulnerable residents. Their extended family was either struggling with their own addiction issues or had already fled Harlem for safer neighborhoods. The social services available to black children in 1944 were minimal and underfunded, leaving the girls to navigate a dangerous adult world with virtually no support or protection. The shooting outside the Red Rooster sent shockwaves through the community that extended far beyond the immediate victims. Residents who had been trying to maintain normal lives despite the growing drug problem suddenly realized that nowhere in their neighborhood was safe from the violence that came with the heroin trade. Church attendance, which had already been declining as people became afraid to walk the streets at night, dropped even further as families worried about being caught in crossfire during Sunday services. Local businesses that had managed to stay open despite pressure from drug dealers began closing earlier or shutting down entirely, as owners decided the risks were no longer worth the minimal profits they were earning. The Morrison shooting also marked a turning point in how law enforcement approached the heroin crisis in Harlem. Detective Murphy and his colleagues had been treating drug-related violence as isolated incidents that could be solved through traditional investigative methods. But the scale and brutality of the confrontation between Vincent's and Marcelli's organizations forced police to acknowledge that they were dealing with something more serious than individual crimes. Police Commissioner William Brady announced a new initiative called Operation Clean Sweep, which would deploy additional officers to Harlem and authorize more aggressive tactics against suspected drug dealers. The operation sounded impressive in newspaper headlines, but its actual implementation revealed the fundamental flaws in law enforcement's understanding of the heroin crisis. Clean Sweep focused on increasing arrests and conducting highly visible raids that were designed more for public relations than for dismantling drug trafficking networks. Officers would surround buildings where dealing was suspected to occur, arrest everyone present regardless of their actual involvement in drug activity, and confiscate whatever drugs and money they could find. These raids generated impressive statistics that police officials could cite to demonstrate their commitment to fighting drugs. In the first month of Clean Sweep, officers made over 200 arrests and seized thousands of dollars worth of heroin and other contraband. Commissioner Brady held press conferences where he displayed tables covered with confiscated drugs and announced that major progress was being made in the war against narcotics. But the actual impact of these raids on drug availability and community safety was minimal. The people arrested were almost exclusively low-level dealers, users, and bystanders who could be easily replaced within days of their removal from the streets. The major organizers like Vincent and Marcelli were rarely caught in these operations because they had the resources and intelligence networks necessary to avoid police attention. More importantly, the aggressive tactics used in Clean Sweep created new tensions between police and community residents who were already struggling with the effects of the heroin epidemic. Officers conducting raids often couldn't distinguish between drug dealers and innocent residents, leading to situations where law-abiding citizens were arrested, harassed, or had their homes searched without justification. Mrs. Gladys Washington learned this lesson painfully when clean sweep officers raided her apartment building on Amsterdam Avenue. Gladys was a 62-year-old retired school teacher who had lived in the same apartment for 15 years and was known throughout the building as someone who looked out for her neighbors and tried to maintain community standards despite the deteriorating conditions around her. When officers stormed into the building looking for suspected drug dealers, they broke down Gladys's door along with several others, apparently operating on the assumption that drugs could be hidden in any apartment. They ransacked her modest home, destroying furniture and personal belongings while searching for evidence that didn't exist. Gladys, who had never used drugs and had actually been trying to organize other residents to pressure drug dealers to leave their building, found herself handcuffed and questioned as if she were a criminal. The officers eventually released her without charges, but not before she had spent 6 hours in custody and watched helplessly as her life's possessions were destroyed by people who were supposedly trying to protect her community. The psychological impact of this experience on Gladys was devastating. She had grown up believing that police officers were protectors who could be trusted to help law-abiding citizens. The raid shattered that belief and left her feeling vulnerable and abandoned by the very institutions that were supposed to provide safety and security. Gladys's experience was repeated dozens of times during clean sweep operations, creating a growing sense among Harlem residents that they were under siege not just from drug dealers, but from law enforcement as well. People who had initially supported aggressive police action against drug trafficking began to question whether the cure was worse than the disease. This erosion of trust between police and community had long-term consequences that extended far beyond the immediate impact of individual raids. When residents stopped cooperating with police investigations, it became much more difficult to solve crimes or gather intelligence about drug trafficking operations. When people stopped calling police to report suspicious activity, drug dealers gained more freedom to operate without fear of detection. The failure of clean sweep to produce lasting improvements in community safety while simultaneously damaging police-community relations illustrated the fundamental inadequacy of treating drug addiction as purely rather a law enforcement problem. But then, reconsidering their approach, police officials doubled down on aggressive tactics and called for even more resources to fight what they characterized as a war against drugs. Meanwhile, the actual war between Vincent's and Marcelli's organizations continued to escalate, bringing new levels of violence to streets where children played and families tried to maintain normal lives. The second major confrontation occurred in early September outside PS 139, an elementary school on 141st Street, where over 800 children between the ages of 5 and 12 received their education. The timing, because, was particularly tragic. The shooting began just as school was being dismissed for the day, meaning that dozens of children were walking out of the building when gunfire erupted. The conflict started when Marcelli's crew attempted to establish a dealing operation directly across from the school, calculating that the constant foot traffic of parents picking up children would provide excellent cover for drug transactions. Vincent's organization couldn't allow this territorial expansion without appearing weak to their own dealers and customers, so they dispatched a team to remove Marcelli's people from the school area. What followed was a running gun battle that lasted nearly 20 minutes and involved over 30 shots being fired in broad daylight on a busy street filled with children and their parents. Teachers frantically tried to get students back inside the school building, while parents ran through the chaos looking for their children. 9-year-old David Chen was walking home with his younger sister Amy when the shooting began. David had been born in Harlem to parents who had immigrated from China in the 1920s and established a small laundry business that served the neighborhood. The Chen family had worked hard to integrate into the community while maintaining their cultural traditions, and David spoke both English and Cantonese fluently. When the gunfire started, David instinctively grabbed Amy's hand and tried to find shelter behind a parked car. But the chaos was so intense and the shooting was coming from multiple directions making it impossible for a 9-year-old to determine where safety might be found. David and Amy crouched behind the car for what seemed like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, listening to bullets hitting metal and glass around them, while adults screamed and ran in all directions. The psychological trauma of that afternoon would affect David for the rest of his life. Years later, he would still wake up from nightmares about the sound of gunshots and the feeling of not knowing whether he and his sister would survive to see their parents again. The sense of helplessness and terror that he experienced as a child, hiding behind that car, became a defining memory that shaped his understanding of the world as a fundamentally dangerous place where violence could erupt without warning. David's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Chen, had immigrated to America believing that hard work and education would provide their children with opportunities for a better life than what had been possible in China. They had chosen to live in Harlem because it was one of the few neighborhoods where their family could afford rent, and they had been willing to accept the challenges that came with living in a predominantly black community during a period of significant racial tension. But the heroin epidemic created dangers that went beyond anything the Chen family had anticipated when they decided to make America their home. The violence that erupted outside David's school wasn't the result of racial conflict or economic competition that they might have understood and planned for. It was random, unpredictable violence that could affect anyone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The shooting outside PS 139 finally forced city officials to acknowledge that the heroin crisis in Harlem had reached levels that required more than traditional law enforcement responses. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia announced the creation of a special task force that would coordinate efforts between police, public health officials, and community organizations to address what he called the narcotics emergency in Upper Manhattan. The task force represented the first official recognition that drug addiction might require medical and social interventions rather than purely punitive measures. Dr. Marie Williams, a psychiatrist who had been studying addiction at Bellevue Hospital, was appointed to lead the medical component of the response, while Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was asked to coordinate community outreach efforts. Dr. Williams had been one of the few medical professionals in New York who understood that heroin addiction was a complex condition that involved physical dependency, psychological factors, and social circumstances. Her work at Bellevue had given her direct experience treating addicted patients, and she had become convinced that punishment alone would never solve the addiction crisis. When Dr. Williams began her work with the task force, she immediately recognized that the scope of the heroin problem in Harlem was much larger than city officials had acknowledged. Her preliminary surveys suggested that over 3,000 residents were actively using heroin, with addiction rates particularly high among young men between the ages of 18 and 25. More troubling was her discovery that addiction was spreading beyond the jazz musician community and street-level dealers, who had been the initial focus of law enforcement attention. Dr. Williams found evidence of heroin use among factory workers, domestic employees, students, and even some professionals who had managed to conceal their addiction while maintaining apparently normal lives. The case of Dr. James Patterson illustrated how heroin had penetrated even the most respectable segments of Harlem society. Dr. Patterson was a 38-year-old physician who operated a small practice from a storefront on Lenox Avenue, providing medical care to residents who couldn't afford to travel to downtown hospitals or pay the fees charged by white doctors. Dr. Patterson had graduated from Howard University Medical School and completed his residency at Harlem Hospital, representing exactly the kind of professional success that parents in the community hoped their children might achieve. He was married, owned his own home, and was actively involved in church and community activities. But Dr. Patterson had also been using heroin for over 2 years, initially starting with small amounts that he told himself were helping him cope with the stress of running a medical practice in an underserved community, the demands of treating patients with limited resources, dealing with the violence and trauma that were becoming commonplace in the neighborhood, and managing the financial pressures of operating a small business had created levels of stress that Dr. Patterson felt unprepared to handle. Heroin had initially seemed like a reasonable solution to these pressures. The drug provided temporary relief from anxiety and emotional exhaustion, allowing Dr. Patterson to continue functioning professionally while numbing the psychological pain that came with witnessing so much suffering in his community. But as Dr. Williams understood from her work with other addicted professionals, the temporary relief that heroin provided came at the cost of increasing physical dependency and psychological reliance. Dr. Patterson found that he needed larger and more frequent doses to achieve the same effects, and he began experiencing withdrawal symptoms when he tried to stop using the drug. The progression from occasional use to daily addiction happened gradually enough that Dr. Patterson was able to rationalize each step as a temporary measure to help him through particularly difficult periods. By the time he recognized that he had lost control over his drug use, he was physically dependent on heroin and terrified of the withdrawal symptoms that would accompany any attempt to quit. Dr. Patterson's addiction remained hidden from his patients and colleagues for months because he had the medical knowledge necessary to manage his drug use in ways that maintained his professional functionality. He knew how to time his doses to avoid obvious intoxication during patient consultations, and he understood enough about addiction to recognize the warning signs that might alert others to his condition. But maintaining this facade required Dr. Patterson to obtain increasingly large quantities of heroin, which eventually brought him into contact with the same dealer networks that were supplying street-level users throughout Harlem. The professional respectability that had initially protected him from suspicion began to erode as he spent more time and money in the underground drug economy. The situation reached a crisis point when Dr. Patterson was arrested during one of Operation Clean Sweep's raids on a building where he had gone to purchase heroin. The arrest of a respected physician for drug possession created a scandal that reverberated throughout the Harlem community and forced people to confront the reality that addiction could affect anyone, regardless of their social status or professional achievements. Dr. Williams used Dr. Patterson's case to illustrate her argument that heroin addiction was a medical condition that required treatment rather than punishment. She pointed out that a physician who understood the health risks associated with drug use better than almost anyone else had still been unable to control his addiction through willpower or professional knowledge alone. This suggested that addiction involved biological and psychological factors that couldn't be addressed through moral judgment or criminal sanctions. Dr. Williams argued that Dr. Patterson and thousands of other addicted residents needed medical treatment, psychological support, and social services rather than incarceration and stigmatization. But Dr. Williams's medical approach to addiction treatment faced significant obstacles in a society that preferred to view drug use as evidence of moral failure rather than symptoms of a complex health condition. Many city officials and community leaders were uncomfortable with the idea that drug addiction might not be entirely the fault of individual users, preferring explanations that focused on personal responsibility and character defects. The resistance to treating addiction as a medical issue was particularly strong among law enforcement officials who had built their careers around the assumption that crime was the result of individual choices that deserved punishment. Commissioner Brady and other police leaders argued that providing medical treatment to drug addicts would only encourage more people to experiment with heroin by removing the fear of consequences. This philosophical conflict between medical and law enforcement approaches to addiction would define debates about drug policy for decades to come. But in 1944 Harlem, the immediate priority was finding ways to help people like Dr. Patterson, Michael Rodriguez, and thousands of other residents who had become trapped in cycles of addiction and criminal behavior that were destroying their lives and their community. Dr. Williams began establishing what she called treatment centers in storefronts and church basements throughout Harlem, offering medical care and counseling to addicted residents who were willing to seek help. These centers represented some of the first systematic attempts to provide alternatives to incarceration for people struggling with drug addiction. The treatment approach that Dr. Williams developed was necessarily experimental, since very little research had been conducted on effective methods for helping people overcome heroin addiction. She combined medical interventions designed to manage withdrawal symptoms with counseling sessions that addressed the psychological and social factors that had contributed to individual addiction cases. One of Dr. Williams's early patients was Carmen Rodriguez, Michael's mother, who had finally discovered the true source of her son's income and was desperate to find ways to help him escape from the drug dealing that had initially seemed like salvation for their family's financial problems. Carmen had begun to suspect that Michael's work wasn't as legitimate as he claimed when she noticed that his hours were irregular and his explanations about his employer were vague and inconsistent. The final confirmation came when she found a substantial amount of cash hidden in Michael's bedroom, far more money than any legitimate part-time job would have provided to a 16-year-old. When Carmen confronted Michael about the money, he initially tried to maintain the fiction that he was working as a courier for a legitimate business. But the weight of maintaining this lie, combined with his genuine love for his mother and his growing awareness of the dangers he was facing on the streets, eventually led him to confess the truth about his involvement with Vincent's organization. The conversation between Carmen and Michael that night was one of the most painful experiences either of them had ever endured. Carmen felt responsible for her son's involvement in drug dealing, believing that her inability to provide adequate financial support had forced him to seek illegal alternatives. Michael felt guilty about lying to his mother and bringing danger into their home, but he also felt trapped by financial circumstances that seemed to leave him with no better options. Both mother and son were crying as they tried to figure out how to extract Michael from his involvement with Vincent's organization without putting their family in danger or destroying their newfound simply owned financial stability. Carmen understood telling Michael to quit dealing drugs wouldn't address the underlying economic pressures that had led him to that work-in center provided Carmen the first place. Dr. Williams's treatment with the first realistic hope she had found for helping her son escape from the drug trade. The center offered counseling services that could help Michael understand the psychological factors that had made drug dealing seem appealing, while also providing practical assistance with finding legitimate employment and educational opportunities. More importantly, the center's staff understood that successful treatment required addressing the social and economic conditions that had made illegal drug work seem necessary in the first place. They helped Carmen apply for public assistance programs that could provide temporary financial support, while Michael transitioned away from dealing, and they connected the family with job training programs that might provide Michael with marketable skills for legitimate employment. The process of helping Michael leave Vincent's organization was complicated and dangerous. Drug dealing networks like Vincent's didn't typically allow people to simply walk away from their involvement, especially when those people had detailed knowledge about operations, territories, and personnel that could be valuable to law enforcement or rival organizations. Vincent himself was surprisingly understanding when Michael explained that he wanted to leave the drug trade to focus on school and legitimate work. Vincent had grown up in similar circumstances and understood the appeal of trying to build a legal career, rather than remaining in illegal activities that carried constant risks of violence and incarceration. But Vincent also explained that Michael's departure would need to be managed carefully to avoid creating security risks for the organization or sending signals to other young dealers that they could freely move in and out of the drug trade according to their personal preferences. Michael would need to gradually reduce his responsibilities over several weeks while training a replacement, and he would be expected to maintain absolute silence about everything he had learned during his time with the organization. This transition period was terrifying for both Michael and Carmen, as they worried that any mistake or misunderstanding could result in violence against their family. Michael continued making his regular rounds and meeting his sales quotas while secretly planning his escape from the drug trade, knowing that Vincent's organization had the power to destroy his life if they suspected he might become a security risk. The successful completion of Michael's transition away from drug dealing represented a small victory for Dr. Williams's treatment approach and provided hope that other young people might be helped to escape from similar situations. But Michael's case also illustrated how individual success stories couldn't address the larger structural problems that continued to push desperate families toward involvement with the drug trade. Even as Michael was building a new life based on legitimate work and education, dozens of other teenagers in similar circumstances were being recruited by Vincent's organization and other dealer networks throughout Harlem. The economic pressures that had initially driven Michael to drug dealing continued to affect thousands of families, creating a constant supply of young people who were willing to accept the risks that came with illegal work. Dr. Williams recognized that her treatment centers could help individuals who were motivated to change their lives, but they couldn't solve the broader social and economic problems that made drug dealing attractive to desperate people in the first place. Addressing the heroin epidemic would require changes in employment opportunities, housing conditions, educational systems, and social services that went far beyond what medical treatment alone could accomplish. Meanwhile, the violence between competing drug organizations continued to escalate, creating new dangers for residents who were already struggling with the effects of widespread addiction. The conflict between Vincent's and Marcelli's crews had expanded beyond disputes over specific territories, to include systematic attempts to disrupt each other's operations through intimidation, theft, and violence. This systematic campaign of mutual destruction reached its peak during the winter of 1944, when both organizations began targeting not just each other's dealers, but the civilians who provided support services to their rivals. Laundromats where opposing crews cleaned their clothes were vandalized. Restaurants where they ate were threatened with arson. Even barbershops where they got haircuts became battlegrounds in this expanding war. The escalation crossed a line that shocked even hardened criminals when Marcelli's organization decided to target the families of Vincent's key lieutenants. The attack came on a cold February morning when Maria Santos was walking her 4-year-old daughter Eleanor to the neighborhood daycare center where she worked part-time to supplement her husband's income. Maria had no direct involvement in the drug trade, but her husband Roberto was one of Vincent's most trusted dealers, responsible for managing sales in a 6-block territory around Marcus Garvey Park. Roberto had tried to keep his family life completely separate from his work, never discussing business at home and taking elaborate precautions to ensure that his criminal associates never learned where he lived or met his wife and daughter. But Marcelli's crew had been conducting surveillance on Vincent's organization for weeks, following dealers home and mapping out their personal relationships. They had identified Maria and Elena as leverage that could be used to pressure Roberto into switching sides or providing information about Vincent's operations. The attack was swift and brutal. 2 men approached Maria as she was crossing 124th Street with Elena, grabbing the little girl and threatening to hurt her unless Maria delivered a message to her husband. The message was simple. Roberto had 24 hours to begin working for Marcelli's organization, or his family would pay the consequences. Maria was released unharmed, but the psychological impact of watching strangers threaten her daughter's life was devastating. She had grown up believing that criminals followed certain codes that protected innocent people, especially children. The realization that drug dealers were willing to target 4-year-old girls to advance their business interests shattered her faith in any kind of moral order. Roberto faced an impossible choice. Switching sides would betray Vincent, who had provided steady income for Roberto's family and had treated him with more respect than he had ever received from legitimate employers. But refusing to switch might result in violence against Maria and Elena, the 2 people Roberto cared about most in the world. The situation was complicated by Roberto's genuine loyalty to Vincent and his understanding of how the drug trade actually worked. Roberto knew that people who switched sides were never fully trusted by their new organizations and were often eliminated once they had served their purpose. Joining Marcelli might provide temporary protection for his family, but it would also mark Roberto as unreliable in the eyes of both criminal organizations. After agonizing over the decision for hours, Roberto chose a third option that he hoped might protect his family while avoiding betrayal of Vincent. He decided to take Maria and Elena and flee New York entirely, abandoning everything they had built in Harlem to start over in another city where neither criminal organization could reach them. Roberto's decision to flee rather than fight or switch sides sent shockwaves through both criminal organizations. Vincent interpreted the departure as evidence that Marcelli's intimidation tactics were effective and that other dealers might abandon him if they faced similar pressure. Marcelli saw Roberto's flight as confirmation that targeting families would force Vincent's organization to collapse from within. The result was an explosion of violence directed at the civilian population of Harlem, as both organizations began systematically targeting the families, friends, and associates of their rivals. Children walking to school were followed by strange men. Wives shopping for groceries were approached with threatening messages. Elderly parents were harassed at church services. This expansion of violence beyond the criminal participants themselves marked a fundamental change in how the trade operated in Harlem. What drug had begun as business disputes between competing dealers had evolved into a reign of terror that affected every resident of the neighborhood, regardless of their connection to drug trafficking. Mrs. Dorothy Thompson experienced this terror firsthand when she answered her door one evening to find two men asking about her nephew Kevin, who worked as a lookout for Vincent's organization. The men claimed to be friends of Kevin's who wanted to leave a message for him immediately, but Dorothy sensed something dangerous about their demeanor and the way they kept looking past her into the apartment. Dorothy had raised Kevin since he was 12 years old, after his parents died in a car accident, and she knew about his involvement with drug dealers, despite his attempts to keep that part of his life secret from her. She had tried repeatedly to convince Kevin to find legitimate work, but the economic realities facing young black men in 1940s, Harlem made drug dealing far more lucrative than any legal employment Kevin could obtain. When the men at Dorothy's door began asking specific questions about Kevin's schedule and habits, she realized they were planning to hurt her nephew and were trying to gather information that would help them find him. Dorothy told the men that Kevin no longer lived with her and that she had no knowledge of his current whereabouts. But she could see in their eyes that they didn't believe her. The men left without violence, but they returned 3 more times over the following week, each time becoming their questioning more aggressive in and more explicit in their threats. Dorothy understood that they were trying to pressure her into providing information that would help them locate Kevin, and she lived in constant fear that they might hurt her as a way of sending a message to her nephew. The psychological toll of this sustained intimidation was enormous. Dorothy, who had worked as a seamstress for over 20 years and had never been involved in any kind of criminal activity, found herself unable to sleep at night and afraid to leave her apartment during the day. She lost weight, developed chronic headaches, and began experiencing panic attacks whenever she heard unexpected knocks at her door. Dorothy's situation was repeated in dozens of households throughout Harlem as the violence between drug organizations spread beyond the dealers themselves to encompass anyone who might have information or influence that could be used as leverage. Grandmothers, siblings, romantic partners, and even childhood friends found couldn't escape they didn't understand, and themselves caught in conflicts. The expansion of violence to include civilian targets finally prompted federal intervention in what had previously been treated as a local law enforcement issue. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover announced that the Bureau would begin investigating organized crime involvement in narcotics trafficking, marking the first time that federal resources had been devoted to addressing urban drug problems. Special Agent William Morrison was assigned to lead the FBI's investigation into the Harlem heroin trade. Morrison had spent most of his career investigating bank robberies and other federal crimes that involved clear-cut violations of federal law by individual perpetrators. The complex network of relationships and activities that characterized drug trafficking presented entirely new challenges that required different investigative techniques. Morrison's first discovery was that the heroin problem in Harlem was much more sophisticated and well organized than local law enforcement had recognized. The drug trade involved intricate supply chains that brought heroin from international sources through port cities like New York, complex money laundering operations that moved cash through legitimate businesses, and corruption networks that protected drug traffickers from law enforcement interference. More troubling was Morrison's realization that the violence between Vincent's and Marcelli's organizations was just one aspect of a much larger criminal economy that had taken root in Harlem. Drug trafficking had created opportunities for other forms of illegal activity, from weapons sales to protection rackets to illegal gambling operations that served the drug dealers and their customers. The FBI's investigation revealed that heroin trafficking had become so profitable that it was attracting investment from criminal organizations throughout the northeastern United States. The money being generated in Harlem was being used to finance criminal operations in other cities, creating a regional network of illegal activity that crossed state lines and fell under federal jurisdiction. Morrison's team began using wiretaps, surveillance, and undercover operations to gather evidence about the structure and operations of the drug trafficking networks. But they quickly discovered that the violence between competing organizations made their investigation extremely dangerous for everyone involved, including federal agents. The danger became personal for Morrison when his cover was blown during an undercover operation designed to gather evidence about Marcelli's money laundering activities. Morrison had been posing as a businessman interested in investing in legitimate enterprises that could be used to hide drug profits, but someone within Marcelli's organization discovered his true identity and put out a contract on his life. Morrison was forced to wear a bulletproof vest and travel with armed escorts for months while the FBI worked to neutralize the threat against him. The experience gave him a new appreciation for the fear that ordinary Harlem residents lived with every day. As the violence between drug dealers and police officers, organizations continued to escalate. But Morrison's investigation also provided hope that the cycle of violence and addiction might finally be broken through systematic law enforcement action that targeted the leadership and financial structure of the drug trafficking networks, rather than just arresting street-level dealers and users. The breakthrough came when the FBI discovered that both Vincent's and Marcelli's organizations were using the same corrupt bank official to launder their drug profits. Thomas Brennan worked as a vice president at Manhattan Savings and Trust, a small bank that served many of the legitimate businesses in Harlem and had developed a reputation for being willing to work with entrepreneurs who might not qualify for loans from larger institutions. Brennan had initially become involved in money laundering through what seemed like routine banking services for small business owners who dealt primarily in cash. Many legitimate enterprises in Harlem operated on a cash basis because their customers didn't have bank accounts or credit cards, making it difficult for traditional banking institutions to distinguish between legal and illegal sources of cash deposits. The transition from legitimate banking services to active participation in money laundering happened gradually as Brennan realized how much money he could make by asking fewer questions about the source of large cash deposits. Drug dealers were willing to pay substantial fees for banking services that helped them convert cash into more manageable forms and create paper trails that made their income appear legitimate. Brennan's involvement with both criminal organizations gave the FBI leverage they could use to gather evidence about the internal operations of both Vincent's and Marcelli's networks. When agents confronted Brennan with evidence of his money laundering activities, he agreed to cooperate with their investigation in exchange for reduced charges and protection from the criminal organizations he had been serving. The intelligence that Brennan provided allowed the FBI to map out the entire structure of both drug trafficking organizations, from street-level dealers to high-level coordinators who managed territories and supervised operations. More importantly, Brennan's cooperation gave agents access to financial records that documented the enormous profits being generated by heroin sales in Harlem. Morrison's investigation revealed that Vincent's organization alone was generating over $50,000 per month in profits from drug sales, an astronomical amount of money by 1940s standards that exceeded the annual income of most legitimate businesses in Harlem. Marcelli's organization was even more profitable, generating nearly $70,000 per month through higher volume sales and more efficient operations. These profit figures helped explain why the violence between the two organizations had become so intense and why both groups were willing to target civilian populations to gain competitive advantages. The stakes involved in controlling heroin distribution in Harlem were high enough to justify almost any level of violence or intimidation that might help secure or expand market share. But the investigation also revealed the human cost of these enormous profits. The money being generated by drug sales was coming directly from the pockets of addicted residents who were spending their rent money, grocery money, and children's clothing money to purchase heroin. Families were being destroyed financially as addiction consumed increasing portions of their household budgets. Dr. Williams's treatment centers were seeing patients who had sold their furniture, jewelry, and personal possessions to finance their drug purchases. Parents were arriving at her clinics asking for help with children who had stolen money from family members to buy heroin. Elderly residents were reporting that their own grandchildren had robbed them to support drug habits. The economic impact of widespread addiction extended beyond individual families to affect the entire commercial life of the neighborhood. Businesses that had served the Harlem community for decades were losing customers who no longer had disposable income to spend on anything except drugs. Landlords were struggling with tenants who spent their rent money on heroin and then faced eviction for non-payment. Even churches, which had traditionally served as anchors of stability in the community, were experiencing financial difficulties as congregation members reduced their donations to divert money toward drug purchases. The social institutions that had made Harlem a center of cultural creativity were being undermined by the economic drain of widespread addiction. Mary Johnson's small restaurant on 135th Street provided a perfect example of how addiction was destroying the economic foundation of the community. Mary had opened her restaurant in 1938, with savings from 15 years of working as a domestic servant for wealthy white families in Manhattan. The restaurant served traditional Southern cooking to residents who missed the food of their childhoods and couldn't find authentic versions elsewhere in New York. For several years, Mary's restaurant had been a profitable business and a popular gathering place where residents could enjoy good food while socializing with their neighbors. The restaurant employed the community people from 6 and served over 100 customers per day during peak periods. But as heroin addiction spread throughout the neighborhood, Mary began losing customers who could no longer afford to eat in restaurants. Regular patrons who had previously visited several times per week stopped coming entirely as they redirected their spending toward drug purchases. Other customers began asking for smaller portions or sharing meals to reduce their costs. The decline in business forced Mary to reduce her staff from 6 employees to 3, then to 2, then finally to just herself and her teenage son, who helped serve customers after school. Even with these cost reductions, Mary was struggling to pay rent and keep the restaurant operating. The final blow came when 3 of Mary's remaining regular customers were arrested during an Operation Clean Sweep raid and sentenced to jail that terms would keep them away from the neighborhood for months. These customers had represented % of Mary nearly 20's remaining business, and their absence pushed her restaurant's finances beyond the breaking point. Mary was forced to close her restaurant in the spring of 1945, ending a business that had served the community for 7 years and provided employment for dozens of residents. The closure eliminated another gathering place where people could maintain social connections and community relationships that were essential for neighborhood stability. The pattern repeated itself throughout Harlem as businesses closed, jobs disappeared, and the economic infrastructure that supported community life gradually collapsed under the pressure of widespread addiction. The heroin epidemic wasn't just destroying individual lives, it was dismantling the entire social and economic foundation that had made the Harlem Renaissance possible. Meanwhile, federal agents were preparing to execute the largest coordinated law enforcement operation in the history of American drug enforcement, Morrison's investigation had provided enough evidence to justify simultaneous raids on both Vincent's and Marcelli's organizations, with the goal of arresting the leadership of both groups and seizing their assets. The operation, codenamed Harlem Thunder, involved over 200 federal agents, local police officers, and prosecutors working together to dismantle what officials described as the most sophisticated drug trafficking network ever discovered in the United States. The raids were scheduled for dawn on June 15, 1945, with teams simultaneously hitting dozens of locations where the drug organizations conducted business or stored money and drugs. Vincent Martinez was arrested at his apartment on St. Nicholas Avenue while eating breakfast with his girlfriend and her 2 young children. The arrest was conducted without violence, partly because Vincent understood that resistance would only result in additional charges, and partly because he had been expecting this moment for months as law enforcement pressure increased. When federal agents searched Vincent's apartment, they found over $15,000 in cash hidden in various locations, along with detailed records of drug sales, territory assignments, and personnel decisions that provided investigators with comprehensive documentation of how his organization operated. Vincent's arrest was simultaneously shocking and anticlimactic for residents who had watched his organization grow from a small network of individual dealers to a sophisticated criminal enterprise that controlled significant portions of their neighborhood. Many people had expected that Vincent's eventual downfall would involve dramatic gun battles or spectacular acts of violence rather than a quiet arrest over breakfast. Tony Marcelli's arrest was more dramatic but equally decisive. Federal agents surrounded his headquarters, a fortified apartment building on Amsterdam Avenue, and used loudspeakers to demand his surrender. When Marcelli refused to come out peacefully, agents used tear gas to force him from the building, leading to a confrontation that lasted several hours and attracted hundreds of spectators. The arrests of Vincent and Marcelli, along with over 60 other defendants charged in connection with their organizations, represented the largest drug enforcement success in American history up to that point. Federal prosecutors announced that they had dismantled criminal enterprises that had generated profits and had corrupted dozens of legitimate businesses throughout Harlem, but over $2 million in illegal. The immediate impact of these arrests on drug availability and community safety was much smaller than law enforcement officials had anticipated. Within weeks of the raids, new dealers had appeared on the same street corners where Vincent's and Marcelli's crews had previously operated, selling heroin to the same customers who had been purchasing drugs before the arrests. The fundamental problem was that while law enforcement had successfully removed the individuals who had been organizing drug trafficking, they had not addressed the economic and social conditions that made drug dealing attractive to desperate people or that created demand for illegal drugs among addicted residents. Young men like Carlos Rivera, who had been working legitimate jobs in factories and warehouses, quickly recognized that the elimination of established drug organizations had created business opportunities for anyone willing to accept the risks involved in drug trafficking. Carlos had been earning $35 per week as a loading dock worker, barely enough to support his wife and infant son in their cramped apartment on Malcolm X Boulevard. When Carlos learned that drug dealers in his neighborhood were earning several times his legitimate wages, the financial incentives were impossible to ignore. The arrests of Vincent and Marcelli had eliminated the established hierarchies that might have prevented Carlos from entering the drug trade, creating space for new entrepreneurs willing to serve the demand that continued to exist among addicted residents. Carlos began dealing heroin on a small scale, selling to neighbors and co-workers who had previously purchased drugs from Vincent's organization. The profits were immediately apparent and dramatically superior to anything Carlos could earn through legitimate employment. Within a month, he was earning more from drug sales than he had previously made in 3 months of factory work. The emergence of new dealers like Carlos illustrated the fundamental limitation of law enforcement approaches that focused on arresting individual criminals, rather than addressing the underlying social and economic factors that made drug trafficking attractive and sustainable. Dr. Williams had predicted this outcome in her reports to city officials, arguing that successful drug enforcement would require comprehensive social programs that provided legitimate economic opportunities for potential dealers while offering effective treatment for addicted users who created demand for illegal drugs. But the political and financial commitment necessary for such comprehensive approaches was far beyond what city and federal officials were willing to consider in 1945. It was much easier to declare victory after high-profile arrests than to invest in the long-term social programs that might actually reduce drug trafficking and addiction. The failure of Harlem Thunder to produce lasting improvements in community safety led to growing frustration among residents who had initially supported aggressive law enforcement responses to the drug crisis. People began to understand that arrests alone would never solve the problems that were destroying their neighborhood. This frustration was particularly acute among community leaders who had been advocating for investment in education, employment programs, and social services that might address the root causes of drug trafficking and addiction. Leaders like Reverend Powell argued that the millions of dollars spent on law enforcement operations could have been used more effectively to create legitimate opportunities for young people who were being drawn into the drug trade. The debate between law enforcement and social service approaches to drug problems would continue for decades, but by 1945, it was already clear that the Harlem heroin epidemic had fundamentally changed how American society understood and responded to drug-related issues. The policies and attitudes developed during this crisis would shape national drug policy for generations to come. Meanwhile, the human cost of the epidemic continued to mount as addiction spread to new segments of the population, and the violence associated with drug trafficking evolved to meet new competitive pressures. The arrest of Vincent and Marcelli had eliminated two major organizations, but it had also created instability that made the drug trade even more dangerous and unpredictable. The summer of 1945 brought a new wave of violence as multiple smaller organizations competed for the territories and customers that had previously been controlled by Vincent's and Marcelli's crews. Without the established territorial agreements and business relationships that had provided some structure to the drug trade, conflicts erupted constantly as dealers fought over street corners, customer bases, and supply sources. This mentation of the drug trade made frag life even more dangerous for ordinary residents who found themselves caught between multiple competing organizations rather than dealing with two predictable rivals. The violence became more random and less controlled as desperate dealers used increasingly extreme tactics to establish their dominance in the chaotic marketplace. The transformation of Harlem from a center of cultural creativity to a battleground dominated by drug trafficking and addiction represented one of the great tragedies of 20th century American urban history. The community that had produced some of the most important art, music, and literature of the modern era had been devastated by forces that its residents were largely powerless to control. But even as the immediate crisis deepened, the seeds of eventual recovery were being planted by people like Dr. Williams, who continued to develop treatment approaches that would eventually prove effective, and community leaders who maintained their commitment to rebuilding their neighborhood despite the enormous challenges they faced. The story of heroin in the 1930s and 1940s, Harlem would become a template for understanding how drug epidemics develop, spread, and ultimately transform entire communities. The lessons learned from this crisis would inform efforts to address similar problems in other cities and other eras, though it would take decades before American society developed truly effective approaches to preventing and treating drug addiction. The people who lived through this period carried its effects with them for the rest of their lives, but they also carried forward the knowledge and experience that would eventually help other communities avoid similar devastation. Their struggles and sacrifices laid the groundwork for better understanding of how to protect vulnerable populations from the forces that had nearly destroyed one of America's most vibrant cultural centers. The transformation wasn't just statistical, it was personal. By late 1945, the character of everyday life in Harlem had fundamentally shifted in ways that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. The same streets that had once pulsed with creative energy now carried an undercurrent of fear and desperation that affected everyone, regardless of their connection to the drug trade. Consider the experience of walking through the neighborhood at different times of day. In the morning, parents would hurry their children to school along routes carefully planned to avoid certain corners and buildings where dealers congregated. These weren't the same dealers who had emerged organically from the jazz community. These were harder men, often from outside the neighborhood, who viewed Harlem purely as territory to be exploited rather than a community to be served. The afternoon brought a different kind of tension as students returned from school. Teachers at PS 139 had begun implementing unofficial policies about dismissal times and routes home, trying to minimize the chances that children would witness drug transactions or violence. But in a neighborhood where the drug trade had become so pervasive, complete protection was impossible. Evening was when the full extent of the transformation became apparent. The sidewalks that had once been filled with residents socializing, window shopping, and enjoying the vibrant street life that defined Harlem culture were now largely empty, except for the figures huddled in doorways and moving furtively between buildings. Sarah Martinez understood this transformation intimately. Sarah was a nurse at Harlem Hospital who had grown up in the neighborhood and watched it change from the inside. Her apartment on 138th Street provided a perfect vantage point for observing how the drug epidemic had altered the rhythm and character of daily life in ways that went far beyond the obvious signs of addiction and violence. Sarah's building had housed 12 families in 1940, representing a cross-section of Harlem's working population: postal workers, factory employees, domestic workers, musicians, and small business owners. These families had formed a tight-knit community within the larger neighborhood, sharing childcare responsibilities, organizing building maintenance, and creating the kind of social networks that made urban living manageable and meaningful. By 1945, only 6 of those families remained in the building. 3 had moved away as the neighborhood became more dangerous, seeking safety in other parts of the city, even if it meant accepting worse living conditions or longer commutes to work. 2 families had been destroyed by addiction, with breadwinners lost to overdoses or incarceration, and surviving family members scattered among relatives in other neighborhoods. One family, the Washingtons, had simply disappeared one night, leaving behind all their furniture and belongings in an apparent attempt to escape debts or threats connected to their teenage son's involvement with drug dealers. Sarah never learned what happened to them, but she found their abandoned apartment haunting evidence of how quickly and completely the drug epidemic could shatter families that had seemed stable and secure. The 6 families that remained in Sarah's building lived in a state of constant vigilance that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Doors that had once been left unlocked during the day were now secured with multiple deadbolts. Children who had previously played freely in the building's hallways and courtyard were kept inside except for necessary trips to school. Neighbors who had once socialized regularly now barely spoke to each other, afraid that too much familiarity might draw unwanted attention from drug dealers who were always looking for new customers, or people who might be pressured into providing services. Sarah's work at Harlem Hospital gave her an even clearer view of how the drug epidemic was affecting the community. The emergency room where she worked had been transformed from a facility that primarily treated routine injuries and illnesses into something resembling a battlefield medical unit that dealt with gunshot wounds, overdoses, and trauma cases on a daily basis. The overdose cases were particularly heartbreaking because they often involved people Sarah recognized from the neighborhood. She had treated teachers, store clerks, church members, and even other hospital employees who had been overcome by heroin addiction. Each case represented not just an individual tragedy, but the loss of someone who had been contributing to the community's stability and social fabric. The gunshot wounds were becoming more frequent and more severe as the violence between competing drug organizations escalated. The weapons being used were more powerful than anything Sarah had seen during her early years as a nurse, suggesting that the drug trade was attracting people with access to military-grade firearms and the willingness to use them against anyone they perceived as threats or competitors. But perhaps most disturbing to Sarah were the children who arrived at the emergency room with injuries that were clearly the result of neglect by parents who were too consumed by addiction to provide basic care. She treated toddlers who had fallen downstairs because no adult was watching them, infants who were malnourished because their mothers had spent food money on drugs, and children who had been burned or poisoned because addicted caregivers had left dangerous substances within reach. These cases forced Sarah to confront the reality that the drug epidemic was creating a generation of children who were growing up without the basic safety and nurturing that healthy development required. The long-term consequences of this childhood trauma would extend far beyond the immediate crisis, affecting these children's ability to form relationships, succeed in school, and eventually become productive adults. Dr. Williams had begun studying this phenomenon through her treatment centers, trying to understand how childhood exposure to addiction and violence might be addressed through early intervention programs. Her preliminary research suggested that children who witnessed drug-related trauma were displaying symptoms similar to what psychiatrists were beginning to recognize in soldiers returning from combat: nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty concentrating, and aggressive behavior. The case of 8-year-old Marcus Thompson illustrated the complexity of these childhood trauma issues. Marcus was the grandson of Mrs. Dorothy Thompson, the seamstress who had been terrorized by drug dealers looking for information about her nephew, Kevin. Marcus had been living with his grandmother since his parents died in a car accident, and he had been present during several of the intimidation visits that had left Dorothy fearing for her safety. Marcus began displaying behavioral problems at school that his teachers initially attributed to grief over his parents' death. But as Dr. Williams learned when Dorothy brought Marcus to her clinic, the boy's symptoms were more consistent with ongoing trauma than with normal grief reactions. Marcus was having difficulty sleeping, startling at sudden noises, and becoming violent with classmates who approached him unexpectedly. More troubling was Marcus's preoccupation with violence and weapons. He drew pictures of guns and knives, played games that involved imaginary fights, and talked frequently about wanting to hurt the men who had frightened his grandmother. Dr. Williams recognized that Marcus was developing the kind of hypervigilant, aggressive mindset that would make him particularly vulnerable to recruitment by drug dealers as he got older. The treatment approach that Dr. Williams developed for Marcus involved helping him understand that the fear and anger he was experiencing were normal responses to abnormal situations. She used art therapy and play therapy to give Marcus safe ways to express his emotions, while gradually helping him develop coping strategies that didn't involve violence or aggression. But Dr. Williams also recognized that treating Marcus individually wouldn't address the environmental factors that had traumatized him in the first place. As long as Dorothy continued to live in fear of drug dealers, and as long as Marcus continued to be exposed to the violence and instability that characterized their neighborhood, any therapeutic gains would be limited and potentially temporary. This realization led Dr. Williams to begin advocating for what she called community-based treatment that would address the social and environmental factors contributing to trauma and addiction, rather than focusing exclusively on individual therapy. She argued that healing communities like Harlem would require comprehensive approaches that included housing assistance, job training, educational programs, and community organizing in addition to medical and psychological treatment. The concept was revolutionary for its time, but Dr. Williams was beginning to understand that individual treatment alone would never be sufficient to address problems that were fundamentally social and economic in nature. The heroin epidemic had been created by specific social conditions, and ending it would require changing those conditions rather than simply treating their symptoms. Meanwhile, the political response to the crisis was evolving in directions that would have profound implications for how American society approached drug problems for decades to come. The arrest of Vincent and Marcelli had been presented as a major victory in the war against drugs. But the failure to produce lasting improvements in community safety had created pressure for even more aggressive law enforcement approaches. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., who represented Harlem in the House of Representatives, found himself caught between competing demands from his constituents. Some residents were calling for even more police presence and harsher penalties for drug-related crimes, believing that the problem required stronger law enforcement responses. Others were arguing that police tactics had become too aggressive and were victimizing innocent residents while failing to address the underlying causes of drug trafficking and addiction. Powell's dilemma reflected broader tensions within the African American community about how to respond to problems that were destroying their neighborhoods while avoiding solutions that might increase their vulnerability to discriminatory law enforcement practices. The history of police brutality and discriminatory prosecution in black communities made of law, many residents' suspicious enforcement approaches that gave police broader powers and fewer restrictions on their activities. These concerns proved prophetic as federal drug enforcement agencies began implementing more aggressive tactics that specifically targeted urban communities with large Black and Latino populations. The techniques developed during operations like Harlem Thunder became templates for drug enforcement throughout the country, creating patterns of discriminatory enforcement that would persist for generations. The expansion of federal drug enforcement also created new opportunities for corruption, as the enormous profits involved in drug trafficking provided resources that criminal organizations could use to influence law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and judges. The case of Detective Frank Murphy illustrated how easily well-intentioned police officers could be compromised by the financial temptations that surrounded drug enforcement work. Murphy had been working in Harlem for over a decade and had developed genuine relationships with community residents who trusted him to be fair and honest in his dealings with them. Unlike many of his colleagues, Murphy understood that most drug-related crime was driven by desperation rather than greed, and he had tried to focus his enforcement efforts on violent dealers rather than users or low-level operators who were simply trying to survive economically. But Murphy's effectiveness at identifying and arresting major drug dealers made him a target for corruption attempts by criminal organizations who understood that a compromised police officer could provide invaluable protection for their operations. The first approach came through an intermediary who offered Murphy $500 in exchange for information about upcoming police raids in his patrol area. Murphy immediately rejected the offer and reported it to his superiors. But the incident marked the beginning of a systematic campaign to compromise his integrity. Over the following months, the offers became more sophisticated and harder to refuse. Criminal organizations offered to pay Murphy's mortgage, provide college tuition for his children, and even help his wife find better employment in exchange for his cooperation. The pressure intensified when Murphy's family began receiving threats that made it clear that criminal organizations had detailed knowledge about his personal life and daily routines. His wife was followed while shopping. His children were approached by strangers outside their school, and Murphy himself received phone calls at home warning him that refusing to cooperate would have consequences for his family's safety. The combination of financial incentives and personal threats created exactly the kind of psychological pressure that had successfully corrupted dozens of other law enforcement officials throughout the city. Murphy found himself considering options that would have been unthinkable earlier in his career, not because he had become greedy or immoral, but because he was facing impossible choices between his professional integrity and his family's safety and financial security. Murphy's eventual decision to retire early from the police force rather than face continued corruption pressure represented the loss of exactly the kind of experienced, community-oriented officer who might have been most effective at addressing the drug crisis in ways that served community interests rather than simply generating arrests and prosecutions. The departure of officers like Murphy left drug enforcement increasingly in the hands of personnel who had less understanding of community dynamics and less investment in solutions that would actually improve residents' lives. This shift toward more aggressive, less community-oriented policing contributed to the growing alienation between law enforcement and the communities most affected by drug trafficking and addiction. By the end of 1945, it was becoming clear that the first major heroin epidemic in American history had fundamentally altered not just the communities where it occurred, but the entire framework of American drug policy and law enforcement. The responses developed during the Harlem crisis would be replicated throughout the country as drug problems spread to other cities and other populations. The medicalization of addiction treatment pioneered by Dr. Williams would compete with increasingly punitive law enforcement approaches for dominance in American drug policy. The community-based treatment concepts she developed would eventually influence social work and public health approaches to addiction, though it would take decades before such approaches received adequate funding and political support. The corruption of law enforcement officials like Detective Murphy would become a persistent feature of drug enforcement throughout the country, creating cycles of scandal and reform that would repeat themselves in police departments from coast to coast. The financial resources generated by illegal drug markets would provising individuals and consistently capable of compromised institutions that were supposed to regulate and control them. Most importantly, the transformation of Harlem from a center of cultural creativity to a community and violence would, devastated by addiction, serve as a cautionary tale about how quickly and completely drug epidemics could destroy the social fabric that made communities viable and vibrant. The people who lived through this transformation carried its lessons forward into their future efforts to address similar problems in other times and places. Their experiences provided invaluable knowledge about what worked and what failed in responding to drug crises, though it would take generations before American society fully absorbed and applied these lessons. The children who grew up during the Harlem heroin epidemic would carry its effects with them throughout their lives, but they would also carry forward a deep understanding of how communities could be destroyed by forces beyond their control, and how important it was to develop more effective approaches to preventing and treating addiction. The musicians, writers, and artists who had survived the crisis would eventually rebuild Harlem's cultural institutions, creating new forms of creative expression that reflected their experiences with trauma, addiction, and recovery. Their work would provide inspiration and guidance for future generations facing similar challenges in their own communities. The medical professionals like Dr. Williams, who had pioneered treatment approaches during the crisis, would continue developing and refining their methods, eventually creating the foundation for modern addiction medicine and community-based treatment programs that would help millions of people overcome drug dependency. The law enforcement officials who had witnessed the failure of purely punitive approaches would eventually advocate for more balanced strategies that combined appropriate enforcement with treatment and prevention programs designed to address the underlying causes of drug trafficking and addiction. But in 1945, these future developments were still decades away. The immediate reality for residents of Harlem was that they were living in a community that had been transformed by forces they were still struggling to understand and control. The golden age of the Harlem Renaissance had given way to a much period that darker would test the resilience and creativity that had made their community legendary. The heroin epidemic that had begun in the jazz clubs and street corners of 1930s, Harlem would eventually spread throughout American society, affecting communities that had previously considered themselves immune to such problems. The patterns of addiction, violence, and social disruption that had first appeared in Harlem would be replicated in cities and towns throughout the country as drug trafficking organizations expanded their operations and law enforcement agencies replicated the approaches that had been developed during the original and crisis. The story of jazz needles in 1930s and 1940s, Harlem would become a foundational narrative in American understanding of drug epidemics, providing both warnings about how quickly communities could be devastated and hope about how they might eventually recover and rebuild. The people who lived through this crisis had paid an enormous price for the knowledge they gained. Experiences would eventually help other communities avoid similar, but their Harlem during devastation. The transformation of the heroin epidemic represented both ending and they and a beginning. Era of cultural end of one creativity and community as in, but under also the beginning of new standings about addiction, treatment and recovery, make that would eventually such epidevastating demics less likely and more manageable when legacy they did occur. The of this period would extend far beyond the immediate participants to drug policy, medical influence, American practice, law, and community organizing enforcement techniques, strategies for generations to come. The lessons learned in streets the 1930s and one of Harlem during the 1940s would eventually contribute to more effective approaches to preventing and treating drug addiction, though the cost knowledge hay of gaining that UNBD been almost airably high for the story people who lived through it. The continues, as communities throughout to unfold even today, America continue to struggle with drug epidemics that follow patterns first established during the Harlem heroin crisis. The specific drugs may change, and the affected populations may be different, but the underlying dynamics of how drug epidemics develop, spread, and transform communities remain remarkably consistent with what was first observed in the 1930s and 1940s Harlem. Understanding this history remains crucial for anyone seeking to address contemporary drug problems, because the fundamental social and economic factors that created the conditions for the Harlem heroin epidemic continue to exist in many American communities today. The solutions that eventually proved effective in helping Harlem recover from its crisis continue to provide guidance for communities facing similar challenges in the present era. The people whose stories we have followed through this crisis, the musicians who were trapped by economic addicted, the families apart, the dealers who were torn desperation, attised by violence, the children who were traumatized, the community leaders who fought to maintain hope and dignity in the face of overwhelming challenges, all contributed to a body of knowledge and experience that continues to inform efforts to prevent and treat drug addiction throughout American society. Their struggles and sacrifices were not in vain if we can learn from their experiences and apply those lessons to preventing similar tragedies in other communities and other eras. The story of Jazz and Needles in 1930s, Harlem serves as both a warning and a guide for anyone seeking to understand how drug epidemics develop and how communities can eventually overcome them. The recovery from Harlem's heroin epidemic would prove to be a decades-long process that required fundamental changes in how American society understood addiction, community development, and social policy. But even in the darkest moments of 1945, there were signs that the knowledge gained through this devastating experience might eventually lead to more effective approaches to preventing and treating drug addiction. Dr. Williams's treatment centers had begun to demonstrate that addiction could be successfully treated when approached as a medical condition rather than a moral failing. Her work with patients like Dr. Patterson and Michael Rodriguez had shown that people from all backgrounds could overcome heroin dependency when provided with appropriate medical care, psychological support, and social services that address the underlying factors contributing to their addiction. The success stories emerging from Dr. Williams' centers were still relatively few compared to the enormous scale of addiction throughout Harlem, but they provided crucial evidence that recovery was possible and that treatment approaches could be refined and improved over time. Each successful case provided insights into what worked and what didn't, gradually building a foundation of knowledge that would eventually inform addiction treatment throughout the country. One of Dr. Williams's most remarkable success stories involved Regina Hayes, a 31-year-old mother of 3 who had become addicted to heroin after her husband was killed in a factory accident, leaving her to support their children on a seamstress's wages that were insufficient to cover rent, food, and basic necessities. Regina had initially used heroin to cope with the overwhelming grief and financial stress that followed her husband's death. But within months, she had developed a physical dependency that consumed increasing portions of her limited income. When Regina first arrived at Dr. Williams's treatment center in late 1945, she was on the verge of losing her apartment and having her children removed by social services. Her addiction had progressed to the point where she was unable to work consistently, and her children were frequently left unsupervised while she searched for drugs or recovered from their effects. The treatment approach that Dr. Williams developed for Regina combined medical interventions to manage withdrawal symptoms with practical assistance that addressed the economic and social pressures that had contributed to her addiction. The centre helped Regina apply for emergency financial assistance that prevented her eviction, arranged for temporary childcare that allowed her to attend treatment sessions, and connected her with a job training program that could provide her with skills for better paying employment. But perhaps most importantly, Dr. Williams provided Regina with a community of other recovering addicts who understood the challenges she was facing and could offer practical advice and emotional support. This peer support network proved crucial in helping Regina maintain her recovery during the difficult early months when the temptation to return to drug use was strongest. Regina's recovery process took over a year and involved multiple setbacks and periods of relapse. But by early 1947, she had achieved stable sobriety and was working as a seamstress in a garment factory that paid wages sufficient to support her family. More importantly, she had developed the coping skills and social connections necessary to maintain her recovery, even when facing new stresses and challenges. Regina's success demonstrated that even severe addiction could be overcome when treatment addressed not just the physical dependency, but also the psychological and social factors that had made drug use seem necessary in the first place. Her case became a model for the comprehensive treatment approach that Dr. Williams continued to develop and refine throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. The knowledge gained from cases like Regina's would eventually contribute to the development of modern addiction treatment programs that recognize the complex relationship between individual psychology, social circumstances, and chemical dependency. But in the immediate aftermath of the Harlem crisis, such comprehensive approaches remained experimental and were available to only a small fraction of the people who needed them. Meanwhile, the law enforcement response to the drug epidemic was evolving in directions that would have profound implications for American criminal justice policy. The apparent success of operations like Harlem Thunder in dismantling major drug trafficking organizations had created political pressure for similar operations in other cities, leading to the expansion of federal drug enforcement throughout the country. Special Agent Morrison, who had led the FBI investigation that resulted in the arrests of Vincent and Marcelli, was promoted and assigned to develop similar operations in Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia, where heroin trafficking was beginning to follow patterns similar to what had occurred in Harlem. Morrison's experiences in New York had taught him valuable lessons about the complexity of urban drug markets, but they had also reinforced his belief that aggressive law enforcement was the most effective tool for disrupting drug trafficking networks. Morrison's new assignment took him to Chicago in the summer of 1946, where he found drug trafficking patterns that were remarkably similar to what he had observed in Harlem. The same combination of economic desperation, social marginalization, and criminal opportunity that had created the conditions for widespread heroin use in New York was present in Chicago's South Side, where African American migrants from the rural South had concentrated in overcrowded neighborhoods with limited economic opportunities. The Chicago operation that Morrison developed followed the same basic template as Harlem Thunder: extensive surveillance and investigation to map out drug trafficking networks, cooperation with local law enforcement agencies to coordinate raids and arrests, and prosecution of major dealers under federal conspiracy charges that carried lengthy prison sentences. The immediate results of the Chicago operation were similar to what had occurred in New York. Over 100 defendants were arrested in coordinated raids, substantial quantities of drugs and money were seized, and federal prosecutors announced that major drug trafficking organizations had been dismantled. Newspaper headlines proclaimed another major victory in the war against drugs, and law enforcement officials used the Chicago success to justify expanding similar operations to additional cities. But Morrison was beginning to notice patterns that troubled him about the long-term effectiveness of these enforcement operations. Just as had happened in Harlem, new dealers quickly emerged to replace those who had been arrested. Drug availability on the streets remained relatively constant, despite the removal of major trafficking organizations, and the violence associated with drug trafficking actually increased as competing groups fought to control territory and customers left vacant by the arrests. More troubling to Morrison was his growing awareness that the people being arrested in these operations were predominantly young men from impoverished communities who had turned to drug dealing as one of the few available means of economic advancement. The major organizers and financiers who profited most from drug trafficking were often able to insulate themselves from direct involvement in street-level operations, making them much more difficult to identify and prosecute. Morrison found himself arresting the same types of people he had grown up with in his own working-class neighborhood, young men who had made desperate choices in response to limited opportunities rather than career criminals who had chosen illegal enterprises out of greed or ambition. This recognition created psychological conflicts for Morrison about the work he was doing and its ultimate value in addressing the social problems that created conditions for drug trafficking. These doubts were reinforced when Morrison returned to Harlem in 1947 to check on the long-term results of Operation Thunder. What he found was a neighborhood that remained devastated by drug trafficking and addiction despite the arrests and prosecutions that had been celebrated as major victories just 2 years earlier. New drug organizations had established themselves throughout the area, addiction rates remained high among residents, and the violence associated with drug trafficking continued to terrorize families and destroy community institutions. The apparent failure of law enforcement approaches to produce lasting improvements in community safety led Morrison to begin questioning the fundamental assumptions that guided federal drug enforcement policy. He started reading Dr. Williams's research on addiction treatment and community-based interventions, trying to understand whether there might be more effective approaches to addressing drug problems than the arrest and prosecution strategies that had defined his career. Morrison's evolving perspective on drug enforcement put him at odds with his superiors at the FBI, who were under political pressure to demonstrate continued success in the war against drugs through high-profile operations and impressive arrest statistics. The agency's institutional culture valued aggressive enforcement and viewed any questioning of traditional law enforcement approaches as evidence of insufficient commitment to the mission. The conflict between Morrison's growing doubts and institutional expectations came to a head when he was asked to lead a new operation targeting drug trafficking in Detroit. Morrison requested permission to collaborate with medical and social service professionals to develop a more comprehensive approach that would combine enforcement with treatment and prevention programs. But his superiors rejected this proposal as outside the FBI's jurisdiction and expertise. Morrison's experience illustrated the institutional barriers that prevented law enforcement agencies from adopting more effective approaches to drug problems, even when individual officers recognized the limitations of purely punitive strategies. The political and bureaucratic incentives that shaped federal drug enforcement policy favored approaches that generated impressive statistics and media attention, rather than strategies that might actually reduce drug trafficking and addiction over the long term. Meanwhile, the social and economic conditions that had created the Harlem heroin epidemic were spreading to other communities throughout the country as post-war economic changes affected urban neighborhoods with large minority populations. The same pattern of limited, legitimate economic opportunities, inadequate social services, and concentrated poverty that had made Harlem vulnerable to drug trafficking was present in cities throughout the Northeast, Midwest, and West Coast. The spread of heroin addiction to these new communities followed predictable patterns that reflected what had been learned during the Harlem crisis. Drug trafficking organizations used the same recruitment strategies that had been successful in New York, targeting economically desperate young people and presenting drug dealing as a rational response to limited, legitimate opportunities. The musicians and artists who had been among the first victims of heroin addiction in Harlem had connections throughout the national entertainment industry, and some carried their addiction to other cities where they performed or relocated. Just as had happened in New York, the association between heroin use and artistic creativity created dangerous myths that encouraged experimentation with the drug among creative communities in other cities. The case of Johnny Williams illustrated how addiction spread through professional networks within the entertainment industry. Johnny was a talented trumpet player who had performed with several prominent bands in Harlem during the early 1940s before developing a heroin addiction that eventually destroyed his career in New York. When Johnny could no longer find steady work in Harlem due to his reputation for unreliability, he moved to Los Angeles, hoping to start fresh in the West Coast music scene. Johnny's musical talents were sufficient to get him work with bands in Los Angeles clubs, but his addiction followed him to California and continued to interfere with his professional relationships and performance quality. More troubling was Johnny's role in introducing other musicians to heroin, repeating the same patterns of drug sharing and social recruitment that had spread addiction throughout the Harlem music community. Within 2 years of Johnny's arrival in Los Angeles, several prominent West Coast musicians had developed heroin addictions, and the drug had begun appearing in clubs and social networks that had previously been free from such problems. The same cycle of addiction, violence, and community disruption that had devastated Harlem began to emerge in Los Angeles neighborhoods where musicians and other entertainment industry workers lived and socialized. Johnny's story demonstrated how individual addiction cases could have far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the immediate victims to affect entire communities and professional networks. The mobility of musicians and other entertainment industry professionals meant that drug problems could spread rapidly across geographic boundaries, making local enforcement and treatment efforts insufficient to contain epidemic outbreaks. The recognition that drug addiction was becoming a national rather than local problem led to calls for federal coordination of prevention and treatment efforts. But the political and institutional infrastructure necessary for such coordination did not yet exist. Most medical and social service programs remained locally funded and administered, making it difficult to share successful treatment approaches or coordinate responses to drug trafficking organizations that operated across state and regional boundaries. Dr. Williams had begun advocating for national standards and funding for addiction treatment programs, arguing that the knowledge gained from her work in Harlem could be applied effectively in other communities facing similar problems. She testified before congressional committees about the need for federal investment in treatment and prevention programs that could address the underlying social and economic conditions that made communities vulnerable to drug epidemics. But Dr. Williams's recommendations faced resistance from federal officials who preferred law enforcement approaches that appeared more decisive and politically appealing than the long-term social investments that effective prevention and treatment required. The institutional and political barriers to comprehensive approaches to drug problems would persist for decades, contributing to cycles of crisis and inadequate response that characterized American drug policy throughout the second half of the 20th century. Meanwhile, the immediate task of helping individual communities recover from drug epidemics remained largely in the hands of local organizations and dedicated professionals who worked with limited resources and inadequate support from higher levels of government. The success or failure of these efforts often depended on the commitment and creativity of individuals who were willing to experiment with new approaches despite institutional resistance and funding limitations. The work being done by people like Dr. Williams in Harlem provided models and inspiration for similar efforts in other cities, but each community had to develop its own approaches based on local conditions and available resources. The knowledge and experience gained from these local efforts gradually accumulated into a body of practical wisdom about addiction treatment and community recovery that would eventually influence national policy, though this process took decades to complete. The children who had grown up during the Harlem heroin epidemic were reaching adulthood by the late 1940s, and their experiences provided crucial insights into the long-term effects of childhood exposure to addiction and violence. Some of these young people had been permanently damaged by their experiences and struggled with addiction, mental health problems, and criminal behavior throughout their lives. But others had developed remarkable resilience and strength as a result of surviving such difficult circumstances, and many became leaders in efforts to prevent similar problems in their own communities and the next generation. Their first-hand knowledge of how drug epidemics developed and spread made them particularly effective advocates for prevention and treatment programs that address the root causes rather than just the symptoms of addiction. The story of Jazz and Needles in 1930s Harlem reveals how quickly a cultural renaissance can transform into a devastating crisis when economic desperation meets criminal opportunity. The musicians who sought creative inspiration, the families torn apart by addiction, and the children who witnessed violence they couldn't understand, all paid the price for America's first major heroin epidemic. Their experiences laid the groundwork for everything we know today about addiction, treatment, and the failures of purely punitive approaches to drug policy. Understanding this history isn't just about honoring the past, it's about recognizing the patterns that continue to repeat themselves in communities across America, and finally, learning the lessons that Harlem paid such a terrible price to teach us.